The desert outside Palm Springs in February of 1966 had that particular quality of winter stillness that people who had never been to the desert did not understand was possible, a stillness that was not emptiness but density, the accumulated quiet of a landscape that had been the same for 10,000 years and intended to remain the same for 10,000 more. And Frank Sinatra sat on the rear terrace of his home at 1148 East Elijah Road at 2 in the afternoon, with a glass of iced water he had not touched, and a copy of a contract he had read 4 times without retaining much of it, because his mind was not on the contract. His mind was on a conversation he had conducted the previous evening with a woman named Rosa Delgado, who was 67 years old, and who had been cleaning Frank Sinatra's Palm Springs home every Thursday for the past 8 years. A woman who had moved through his house with a thoroughness and discretion that Frank Sinatra had come to depend on without ever thinking very much about. The way one depends on things that work consistently without requiring attention. And Rosa had knocked on the door of his study the previous evening at 6 o'clock just as she was finishing, and had said, in the careful English that she deployed when she needed to say something important, that she wanted to speak with him about something if he had a moment. And Frank Sinatra had put down what he was reading and said, of course. And Rosa had stood in the doorway of his study and told him that her grandson, a boy named Miguel who was 17 years old and who had been living with Rosa since his parents had separated 3 years ago, had been accepted to study music at a conservatory in Los Angeles, but that the scholarship he had received covered only 2/3 of the cost, and that the remaining third was an amount that Rosa could not provide, and that she had spent 6 weeks trying to find another way to cover it without success, and that she was telling Frank Sinatra not to ask him for money, but because she thought he might know someone who knew someone, might be aware of a foundation or an organization that helped young musicians. And she had delivered this explanation with the specific dignity of someone who had rehearsed it many times, and was determined to present it as a request for information rather than as an appeal for help. And Frank Sinatra had listened to the entire thing without interrupting, and then had asked a few questions about Miguel, what instrument he played and what conservatory, and what the timeline was. And Rosa had answered each question, and then had said thank you for listening, and had gone back to finish what she was doing. And Frank Sinatra had sat in his study afterward for a long time not reading anything, just sitting with what Rosa had told him, and with the particular quality of what she had asked for, which was not money but contacts, not charity but navigation, the thing that people without connections most needed and most rarely received. Miguel Delgado played piano, had been playing since he was 6 years old on a second-hand upright that Rosa had bought at an estate sale, and had paid to have tuned twice a year out of money she could not easily spare, and he had been accepted to the Colburn School in Los Angeles on the strength of an audition that his conservatory teacher, a retired musician who taught out of his home in Cathedral City, had spent 2 years preparing him for, and the acceptance was by any measure an extraordinary thing, was the kind of institutional validation that opened doors which remained closed to talent that had not been formally recognized. And the gap between what the scholarship covered and what the school cost was $3,400, which in 1966 was an amount that represented approximately 4 months of Rosa's earning. Frank Sinatra made 3 telephone calls on the morning of the day. He sat on the terrace with the untouched iced water and the unread contract, and the calls were to 3 different people who operated in 3 different parts of the world that Frank Sinatra moved through. The first was to a man who ran a foundation that supported music education and who owed Frank Sinatra a favor from 1961 that had never been called in. The second was to someone at a music publishing company who occasionally made discretionary grants to promising young musicians. And the third was to a woman who sat on the board of an arts organization in Los Angeles that had a scholarship fund specifically for students at institutions like Colburn. And Frank Sinatra had described Miguel Delgado to each of these 3 people in terms that were accurate and specific, and that communicated exactly what he knew from the conversation with Rosa. And he had framed each call not as a favor request, but as a professional recommendation, had said that he had become aware of a young musician of genuine ability who had been accepted to a serious institution and was facing a funding gap, and that he wanted each of these people to know about Miguel because they were in a position to help if they found the case compelling, And in each call, Frank Sinatra had been careful not to guarantee anything, not to make promises that depended on other people's decision. But the weight of Frank Sinatra making a recommendation was something that each of these three people understood without being told. Understood that when Frank Sinatra said he wanted them to know about something, it meant he wanted them to do something about it. And all three calls were received with the kind of attention that Frank Sinatra's calls reliably received. What happened over the following 2 weeks was a series of events that had the appearance of independent institutional processes, but that had in fact been set in motion by those 3 morning phone calls. And the foundation sent a letter to Miguel Delgado offering a grant that covered exactly the gap between his scholarship and the cost of attendance, with a note explaining that the grant had been made on the basis of his conservatory's recommendation and his audition results, which was true as far as it went. And Miguel received this letter on a Tuesday and brought it to Rosa, and Rosa read it twice, and then sat down at the kitchen table of her small house in Cathedral City and put her face in her hand, not with sadness, but with the specific physical response that people sometimes have when something they have been holding together with pure will is suddenly allowed to release. And Miguel stood beside her, not quite understanding the full depth of what the moment contained, because he was 17 and did not yet know enough about how difficult things were to fully grasp how unusual it was for them to turn out well. Rosa Delgado came to Frank Sinatra's home the following Thursday and cleaned the house with the thoroughness she always brought to it. And when she was finishing, she knocked on the door of his study again, and Frank Sinatra said, "Come in." And Rosa stood in the doorway and said that Miguel had received a grant that would allow him to attend the Colburn School, and that she wanted Frank Sinatra to know in case he had spoken to anyone. And Frank Sinatra looked at her and said, "That's wonderful news, Rosa." And Rosa said, "I think perhaps you made some calls." And Frank Sinatra said, "Miguel's acceptance to Colburn is what got people's attention, Rosa. I just described the situation to a few people who were in a position to be useful." And Rosa looked at him for a moment and then said, "I didn't ask you for money." And Frank Sinatra said, "No, you asked me if I knew anyone who knew anyone, and I did." And Rosa said, "Miguel doesn't know." And Frank Sinatra said, "There's no reason for him to know. The grant came from a foundation based on his work. That's what he should understand." And Rosa was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're a good man, Mr. Sinatra," in the simple, direct way that people speak when they have decided to say something plainly and exactly. And Frank Sinatra said, "I made some phone calls, Rosa. Go home and celebrate with your grandson." And Rosa nodded and left. And Frank Sinatra went back to whatever he had been reading with the particular quality of attention that comes after something has been properly resolved. Miguel Delgado attended the Colburn School from 1966 to 1970 and graduated with a distinction in piano performance, and went on to a career as a concert pianist and a faculty member at a music school in San Diego. And in 1987, when he was 38 years old, he gave an interview to a music education publication in which he described his path to the Colburn School, the second-hand upright piano and the twice-yearly tunings, and the retired teacher in Cathedral City, and the scholarship gap, and the foundation grant. And he said that he had spent years trying to understand how the foundation had learned about him, because the grant had arrived without any prior contact, and with a reference to his audition results that suggested someone had gone to the trouble of assembling his case before presenting it to the foundation. And Miguel said in the interview that he suspected the involvement of someone connected to his grandmother's employer, but that he had never been able to confirm this, and that his grandmother had, when asked, said only that she had mentioned his situation to someone who had known the right people. Rosa Delgado retired from housekeeping in 1972 at the age of 70 and spent her remaining years in Cathedral City, attending Miguel's concerts whenever he performed in Southern California, and she died in 1980, one never having told Miguel directly what had happened in Frank Sinatra's study in February of 1966, not because she wanted to keep it from him, but because she understood that the version Miguel carried, the version in which a foundation had recognized his ability and a grant had arrived on its merits, was a version that served him better than the truth would have, was a version that told him his work had been enough to produce this result, which was the version that a young musician building a career needed to believe about himself. Frank Sinatra was playing a Las Vegas residency when Rosa died and did not learn about it for several weeks. And when he did learn about it, he sat with the information for a while before having flowers sent to Miguel with a card that said only, "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman." And Miguel received the flowers and the card and understood for the first time with certainty what he had long suspected. Understood that the connection between his grandmother's employer and the foundation grant was not coincidental and had never been coincidental, and he sat with this understanding in his apartment in San Diego and felt something complex and layered, felt gratitude and retrospective wonder, and a kind of grief for the years during which his grandmother had known something she had chosen not to tell him. And after a while he put the card from Frank Sinatra in the drawer of his piano bench, where he kept things he wanted to remember, and he went back to practicing, because that was what you did when someone had made an investment in your talent. You honored it by continuing to develop what they had seen in you. And the desert outside Palm Springs in February of 1966 had long since turned to March, and then to the long heat of summer, and then to another winter, while Miguel Delgado's career had extended itself through the decades with the specific quality of something properly founded. And the second-hand upright on which he had first learned to play the piano had been replaced many times over by better instruments in better room. But the hands that played those instruments were the same hands that Rosa Delgado had believed in long before anyone else had thought to, and that Frank Sinatra had made 3 phone calls to protect on a February afternoon when the desert was still, and the iced water went untouched, and the contract went unread. And the thing that needed to be done was done without ceremony or announcement, the way that most things worth doing are done.